Elden Ring is an interesting game to me. To put it simply, it offers an experience of exceedingly high highs and crushingly low lows. On one hand, the game is a genuine masterpiece, with one of the most exceptional and intricate open worlds I have ever seen. It's all laid out in such a way that there is always something new to see around every corner, and what you can find in this game is absolutely mind-blowing. It's so good that I'm not sure if From will ever be able to top it again. And that's not even mentioning the Legacy dungeons, which offer the same tightly designed areas of the other Soulsborne games, all on top of a massive open world. But on the other hand, the game is terrible. So much of its content is the same boring caves and catacombs, meaningless puzzles, worthless rewards, and a sickening overabundance of repeat bosses, even to the point where main story bosses are shamelessly reused. Speaking of those bosses, they are easily some of the worst in the entire series. Their movesets and damage are entirely overtuned, they can completely disregard your playstyle, and they are downright unfair. But for the sake of keeping this intro under 30 minutes, I'll just leave it there. And if any of you write "get good" in the comments without watching the rest of this video, I'm going to be deleting your comment, because I will be covering that argument later on. Where was I again? Oh yeah, Elden Ring sucks, and I can pretty comfortably say that it has produced more frustration out of me than any other game I have ever played. And yet, its greatest moments will stick with me forever. They are just that good. I will never forget the moment I first found Siofra River. It was absolutely magical, a moment of pure wonder and awe on the same level as the original Dark Souls. And that's what makes Elden Ring so interesting to me. It's a game that I can enjoy so much, and yet despise so vehemently. A game that has firmly cemented itself as a landmark title in the history of video games, and yet has plunged from Soulsborne series into depressingly new lows. A game that's half a mess and half a masterpiece. But mistakes are only as bad as you let them be. In fact, they can be amazing tools for learning, as long as you accept that you have made a mistake and try to understand why it happened. Given Elden Ring's success, being the best-selling game From has ever made, it was kind of inevitable that they would eventually release a DLC for this game, and I saw this DLC as the perfect opportunity for From to address the mistakes made in the base game. Even if they couldn't go back and erase those mistakes, a step forward in the right direction would be enough to vastly improve my confidence in the series going forwards. But of course, it was ultimately up to From to decide what to do. And before going into Elden Ring's DLC, I wasn't really sure whether they would actually make any improvements, or if they would just do the exact same thing again. Which honestly feels like what I'm doing at this point. Here I am making a second video on a game company that failed to rectify its own mistakes. Whoops, guess I spoiled it. To be completely blunt here, Shadow of the Erdtree is a pretty massive failure. And even though it still does the same things right as Elden Ring, it also still makes the exact same mistakes. As a matter of fact, it actually doubles down on most of them, in what I can only assume is a misguided attempt to give players more of what Elden Ring offered before, because its formula is what gave them their greatest success. And yet it completely disregards the foundation that the Soulsborne games were originally built off of, a foundation that has kept me interested in the series up until this point. The problem has gotten so bad that nothing Shadow of the Erdtree does can redeem the overall experience for me. This might just be my least favorite DLC FromSoft has ever released. I seriously can't decide whether I like it less or more than Ashes of Ariandel. If you can't already tell, this is going to be a pretty negative review of Elden Ring's DLC, and if you're offended by that, then I would actually implore you to keep watching this video, because I'm not trying to hate on this DLC for no reason. I was planning on making a video on Shadow of the Erdtree regardless of whether I liked it or not, and had I been satisfied by this DLC, then I would have made a video showering it with my praise. But I wasn't, and I'm going to try my best to explain why. You don't have to agree with me, but I do have my reasons. I think at this point, what Shadow of the Erdtree does right is already pretty obvious. However, it probably wouldn't be very fair of me to just focus on the negative aspects of the DLC, without at least giving the positives too. And that starts with the world design, which is unsurprisingly pretty great. The Land of Shadows is visually stunning, and I think that's in no small part due to the giant Scadutree that towers over it. While similarly grand to Elden Ring's Erdtree, its use in the game is a lot different, as it's placed at the very end of the map instead of its center, and it doesn't really measure your progress in the same way. The Scadutree is more of a backdrop to the DLC than anything else, but it adds greatly to its atmosphere and tone. I particularly like the transparent looking sheets that flow from the tree's crown. It looks really great. This entire DLC is pretty much a plethora of alluring sights and scenery. Just from the starting area, there's a floating spiral castle to your left, a jagged mountain to your right, a beautiful flower coast far below you, and a massive keep directly beneath the Scadutree. And those are just the biggest highlights. There are still dozens of smaller sites in between, like the castle in the center of the map, a giant pillar, this cathedral on top of a hill, and a massive dragon corpse. For a DLC, it offers an enormous amount of content to explore, and I now understand why it took them so long to make. They basically packed an entire game into this DLC. It's genuinely impressive. It's also impressive how well Shadow of the Erdtree is able to funnel the player from one area to the next, with hallway-like sections that lead into more open ones to keep the reveal of where you're going a constant surprise. I actually thought the DLC was more linear than the base game because of this, but Elden Ring actually does the same thing too, it's just on a much larger scale. Shadow of the Erdtree is kind of like a miniature version of Elden Ring. It's still open, just scaled down and more concise. Which is my first problem with the DLC. It's more Elden Ring, including the same fantastic world design and the same repetitive content that fills it. Mainly, my biggest issue with Shadow of the Erdtree's world is how it handles its field bosses in the exact same way as Elden Ring. Literally, the exact same way. There's a dragon, and a deathbird, and a falling star beast, and a dragon, and a magma worm, and a mariner, and a dragon, and an ulcerated tree spirit, and a dragon, and a tree sentinel, and, you guessed it, another dragon. How many dragons did I say? 5? Oh, my bad. There's actually 6. Because there just wasn't enough of this exact same type of dragon boss in the base game. And no, one extra lightning move and a different skin doesn't make these bosses unique. While I think the price of admission for this DLC is probably justified considering how much you get, it's still pretty insulting that the developers would so blatantly regurgitate content that you can already experience in the base game into their paid DLC. I don't know about you, but I did not pay for this DLC wanting to fight yet another of the same dragon boss I had already fought at least a dozen times before in the main game. And I didn't fight them. I ended up just running past almost all of the dragons and other repeat bosses, because fighting them would have been a complete waste of my time. This is a pretty lazy move for FromSoft to do, and it lacks any of the originality and inventiveness that I know they are capable of. An example of a reused boss that I do like is Lawrence, which is a reskin of the first boss you fight in Bloodborne. I think the concept of repurposing the first boss of the game into the optional boss of the DLC is an interesting idea. It takes a boss that you probably defeated easily at the beginning of the game and scales it up to late game, which I think is a fun way to test how far your skills have come since you started. But more than that, Lawrence isn't really a reskin. His second phase is totally unique. It takes what you might have thought was a familiar boss and twists it on its head, making the fight more memorable in the process. If you want to reuse a boss, then this is probably the best way to do it, but in Elden Ring's case, they probably could have gotten away with reusing the same dragon fight if it wasn't already so heavily reused in the base game. If there had only been one field dragon in Elden Ring, fighting another one in the DLC would have been amazing. That dragon boss is so good the first time you fight it, and it's a real shame that it inadvertently ends up getting ruined because of how often you end up encountering that exact same fight again and again, just with a different colored dragon. Unfortunately, this is also something Shadow of the Erdtree completely fails to understand as well, because its new field bosses are reused just as aggressively. You can find 8 of these furnace golems throughout the DLC, but unlike the dragons, I'm not sure if these bosses were ever even fun to fight in the first place. Their entire fight boils down to jumping over their AoE attacks and whacking them in the legs, over and over, until they finally fall over and you can do a critical attack on their head, which usually only does half of their health bar, meaning you'll have to do the same thing twice to beat them. I was already bored doing this by the first one I found, and I still had 5 more ahead of me that functioned the exact same way. The other 2 have armor on their feet, and require you to throw pots into their head to kill them instead, which I similarly dislike. You have to get up on these small ledges to actually be able to throw a pot in, all while the golem itself constantly unleashes a barrage of fireballs that track towards you. You can only avoid these fireballs by running away from them, which you can't do on these ledges because there's not enough space. The end result is an incredibly clunky and irritating fight, one that completely misses the potential it could have had. I think this fight would work a lot better if they had designed it more like the ancient Wyvern from Dark Souls 3, perhaps with a spiral design of cliffs around the boss that would give you enough space to run away from its fireball attacks while still moving upwards towards its head. The boss is already a gimmick fight, so they should have just embraced that fully. Of course, this would only work if they removed the 7 other copies of this boss you can fight around the world, but that would be no great loss to me. I've played through Shadow of the Erdtree twice, and on my repeat playthroughs, I didn't fight a single Furnace Golem again. That's how much I disliked them. The other field boss you see a lot in this DLC is the Hippo, and it shows up 4 times. There's actually even a 5th one that's used as an optional boss in the Shadowkeep, but I'll talk more about that fight later. I enjoy fighting these Hippos far more than I do the Furnace Golems, but I'm still not a huge fan of how often they were used, even if it is significantly less than the Golems. Although I will admit that making all of them drop Scadutree fragments does actually make defeating them worthwhile. I really wish that's all I had to say about the new field bosses, but there's unfortunately still one more, and it might even be the worst offender of them all. Because it's literally just a reskin of one of the main bosses of the DLC thrown into a random ruin. I wonder where I've seen that before. It just has more health and can now, for some reason, summon basilisks, because I guess that's fun. While they're at it, why don't they just reskin Messmer and throw him into a random cave? Because it's effectively just as stupid of an idea, regardless of what the lore implications might be. I hate how people say that like it makes up for the fact that the developers are just being blatantly lazy. And please, tell me how the lore explains Godric having a twin brother who also just happened to get into grafting. I think it should go without saying that reusing a major boss like this is an incredibly bad idea, because it only makes the original fight and the build up to it less significant. It also just doesn't make any sense in a gameplay perspective either. In Dark Souls 1, the Capra and Taurus demon bosses showing up as normal enemies later in the game makes sense because they were always normal enemies. Their more complicated late-game movesets make them work well as early bosses, and it's also just more believable that there could be more than one of them. It's the exact same way with the Crucible Knights in Elden Ring. They make for a difficult early game challenge, and it also makes sense that there are multiple of them. The Dancing Lion does not feel like a normal enemy. It is very clearly a unique boss, with an intro cutscene, a second phase, and even its own remembrance. Why would there be more than one of them? There's also no gameplay progression gained from reusing this boss either. It just goes from a difficult late-game DLC boss to a difficult late-game DLC field boss. Its inclusion was clearly done as padding, because From couldn't be bothered to do anything else. These repeat bosses are just one form of padding that Elden Ring tended to struggle with, and another was in how it utilized its caves and catacombs. This is the one mistake Elden Ring makes that Shadow of the Erdtree actually improves upon, though I suspect it might have just been incidental. In Elden Ring, there were far too many caves and catacombs that offered nothing significantly interesting for the player to do, on top of them all looking exactly the same. The catacombs were the worst in this regard, sharing the exact same room layouts and enemies. Obviously, there were exceptions to this. Some of the caves in Elden Ring are genuinely fun to explore, and a couple of the catacombs have interesting gimmicks that differentiate themselves from the others, but these highlights are few and far between. Most of them are functionally the same. It also didn't help that these underground areas almost never gave you anything of worth for exploring them either. Because of the diversity of Elden Ring's different systems, finding a random spell, weapon, or talisman is often only helpful to certain specific builds, and those were the kind of rewards you would mostly get. There are only a small handful of both caves and catacombs in Elden Ring that offer items that are beneficial to every type of build and playstyle, and it's only because they have golden seeds in them. Catacombs do have materials in them that you can use to improve your spirit summons. However, you can also find these same materials in the underground areas, which I'd argue is a far more enjoyable way to collect them. The only side areas in Elden Ring that always have useful items in them are the tunnels, and even though they have many of the same issues as the caves and catacombs, all of them at least offer you something useful, in the form of smithing stones that you can use to upgrade your weapons and gear. Taking all of what I just said into consideration, the caves and catacombs in Shadow of the Erdtree are a lot better in this regard, but I'm not sure if that's something FromSoft was intentionally trying to do, because it might just be the effect of there being less of them. Since Shadow of the Erdtree's map is smaller than Elden Ring's, they obviously couldn't fit nearly as many of them into the DLC. and since there's less of them, it inadvertently makes them all more unique. This also allowed From to use just their best ideas for these caves and catacombs too, avoiding the pitfall that Elden Ring makes of trying to fill up several dozen of them with interesting things to do. I guess it turns out that less actually is more. Who knew? But to talk about the actual content of these areas, I think it's mostly pretty good. I'll start with the underground jails, which act as a replacement to Elden Ring's caves, though there is still one normal cave in the DLC. As their name implies, these jails are all massive underground prisons, filled with jars and jar-themed enemies, including this new meat blob enemy, which I find to be hilariously over-the-top looking. And don't worry, I mean that as an absolute compliment. The Soulsborne series has had some pretty ridiculous-looking enemy designs in the past, and this is yet another one to add to that list, despite its dark implications. While certainly still reminiscent of Elden Ring's caves, the design and new features of these jails are enough to make them a breath of fresh air in comparison, and it was absolutely the right decision to make on From's part. I have certainly had my fill of dark brown tunnels. Speaking of tunnels, they've been pretty overhauled in the DLC as well. Instead of an underground mine, they are now these large lava-filled forges. That sounds like a big difference, and it is, but what makes forges almost functionally identical to the tunnels in Elden Ring is that they are both full of smithing stones. And not just high-level smithing stones, all types of smithing stones. At first, I thought this was a bit unnecessary and unrewarding. I already had a fully leveled weapon going into the DLC, so I didn't really have a use for any of the smithing stones that I got. However, the DLC does have a lot of new weapons to find, and these forges provide materials to upgrade those weapons without forcing you to go back to the main game to find or buy more. There's also only 2 of these forges in the entire DLC, so even if you don't need the materials, they don't take up too much of your time anyways, and you can get the highest level of smithing stone at the end of both of them, which is definitely useful. No boss though, which I found to be a bit weird, but it's honestly a nice change of pace. The only underground areas in Shadow of the Erdtree that stayed the same are the catacombs, but despite that, they actually ended up being my favorite. There's 3 catacombs in total, and each one has a different gimmick. One of them has you running past spikes that stomp down from the ceiling, another one is dark and you have to light it up, and the last one has you avoiding these weird floating basilisk guys, either by ducking behind cover or running past them. Even though these catacombs still share mostly the same rooms and enemies that they did in Elden Ring, all of their different gimmicks were more than enough to keep me engaged, to the point where I really enjoyed exploring all of them. I'd also be remiss not to mention the new cannon imps that they added. The design is really great. Unfortunately, both the catacombs and the new jails fail to address what might be their biggest issue. They still don't supply the player with any universal rewards. This means that once you play through them once, there isn't really any incentive to play through them a second time, other than if you just want to see them again. Which I think was a pretty stupid mistake, considering that Shadow of the Erdtree has the perfect reward for these areas, the Scadutree fragments. This would have been an extremely easy way to make these areas worthwhile to go through every time you play the game, and I'm honestly kind of surprised that From didn't see it either. But there are 2 exceptions to this, the Dragon's Pit Cave in Graveside Plain, and the Darklight Catacomb in Scadu Altus. While not a particularly interesting cave, going through the Dragon's Pit is the only way to reach Jagged Peak, done through another take the plunge you won't die type sequence. Similarly, the Darklight Catacomb connects to another major area as well, the Abyssal Woods. On my first playthrough, this was my favorite area in the game, because it came as such a big surprise. It was the final location on the map that I had yet to uncover, and because of the fog that hangs over the top of the area, I really had no idea what might be down there. And it was well worth the wait. The eerie tone of the Abyssal Woods makes it the most unique area in the game, and the slow build-up towards the return of the Winter Lanterns from Bloodborne was amazing. I think I might even like the use of these enemies better in Shadow of the Erdtree. The Winter Lanterns in Bloodborne, while an interesting gimmick, were pretty annoying, to the point where I would just avoid them if I could. I'm not sure if the developers wanted that to be intentional or not, because there really isn't any way to avoid them if they happen to be in the way, which they almost always are. They're either situated in front of an item or a path, so if there's a certain way you need to go, and a Winter Lantern is also that way, you either have to fight through them or just run by, which doesn't always work out. They work almost exactly the same way in Shadow of the Erdtree, but the reason I like them more is because of a third, new option you are given when encountering them. Hiding. There are tall patches of grass that you can hide in to avoid being detected by the lanterns, further enforcing that feeling of wanting to stay undetected by them, but in a more intentional way. The Abyssal Woods is also full of choke points and funnels that lead further into the area, and they are always full of Winter Lanterns, meaning you'll have to sneak past them in order to progress. It momentarily turns the game into something of a stealth horror experience, where the player has to take opportunities to jump between patches of grass while the lanterns aren't looking. It makes for some pretty tense scenarios, made even worse by these plants that alert the lanterns if you touch them. But if you want to do things your own way, you can still just try running past them, which is even harder to do than in Bloodborne, or you can kill the lanterns by parrying them. All of this combined made for an experience that was nearly on par with some of Elden Ring's best moments, followed closely by my discovery of the Stone Coffin Fissure. Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't have a second underground map like in Elden Ring, but I'm pretty sure this area was meant to be something at least akin to that, and seeing it for the first time really reminded me of when I first saw the Lake of Rot. It was truly breathtaking. But to go back to the Abyssal Woods, you might have noticed when I first started talking about it that I said it was my favorite area on my first playthrough. And that's because the Abyssal Woods unfortunately didn't hold up on my second playthrough. Once you know what to expect, the tension just isn't there anymore, and the sneaking sections with the winter lanterns go from thrilling to boring. You just sit there and wait for one to slowly walk away so you can run over to another bush and wait again. Yes, you could kill them to try and go faster, but the timing for the parry is pretty weird, and if you mess it up, you'll probably just die. Either way, it's still not very exciting. The area is also kind of massive, and Torrent can't be summoned, which makes sense, but it means you'll be doing a lot of running. This is made even worse on a repeat playthrough because you'll already know what places in the area are actually worth visiting, which is only like 3. So you'll spend several minutes just running from one side of the area to the other, which isn't made any easier by the groups of rats you'll run into every 10 seconds. I think what would help this area a lot is if the winter lanterns weren't just confined to one area. If you instead let them patrol the entire area, then things would become considerably more interesting. That way, you'd always be on your guard, because you never know when the next lantern might show up. This doesn't eliminate the waiting problem, but the waiting would be considerably more acceptable and enjoyable if it came as a surprise. An enemy in a horror game can't just do the same thing every time, because there would be literally zero replayability in that. You would know exactly what to do every time, and it would no longer be scary. That's why it's important to have an enemy that is varied and can do multiple things. It's even better if they can react differently depending on what the player is doing. The moment you don't know what an enemy is going to do next is the moment it becomes scary. It adds an element of randomness that keeps things exciting. Along with this, I also think the lanterns would benefit more if there was just one big one instead of several small ones. Imagine if a giant winter lantern just appeared around a corner. It would be terrifying. I can imagine the horror of trying to stay hidden from something like that as you make your way throughout the area, and there could also be more traps to help lure it closer to the player. Obviously, not every game has to be super replayable. I love Outer Wilds, and it's probably one of the least replayable games I've ever played. But all of From's Soulsborne games have been consistently replayable to me, to the point where I've actually even run out of character slots in Dark Souls 1. So replayability is something that I expect from these games, and that's why I'm criticizing it here. As it is, while the Abyssal Woods works great on a first playthrough, it just turns into more of a hike on any repeat one. Unfortunately, the dungeon of the area is just as undercooked. Don't get me wrong, what's there is great, but it is depressingly short. I'd say it only feels like half of a legacy dungeon, but I think it might even be less than that. There's like 4 major rooms, a second floor above those rooms, and the boss. That's pretty much it. What sucks is that if this dungeon was full-sized, it probably would have been amazing. I can only imagine how intricate a full-sized mansion would be. There's so many different interconnecting rooms you could explore, and the way you can fall down to the first floor from the second floor would make for a really interesting mechanic. You could be wandering around the second floor, fall into a crack in the floorboards, and find yourself in an entirely new room, or even section of the mansion. That would have been awesome. It's such a missed opportunity. This dungeon also has an enemy in it that I'm not particularly fond of, these giant horned knights. They are just so aggressive. They do not stop attacking. Either that, or the combos they have are so long that it feels like they never stop attacking. I don't understand why a normal enemy should even have combos in the first place, let alone ones that are this ridiculously long. It feels like you're fighting a mini-boss, but even the actual mini-bosses are still easier. These Death Knights have similarly long combos, but at least they can be staggered. The Horn Knights just tank everything you throw at them. And just like with Bloodborne's Winter Lanterns, they're frustrating to the point where you don't even want to try and engage with them, because if you do, they can kick the absolute shit out of you. These enemies can also be found in the Belrot and Enem Illir Legacy dungeons, and I genuinely think that it brings both of the areas down because of it. These two dungeons are kind of an extension of one another, much like how the Erdtree is connected to Elfale, and I think they're both pretty good, but being forced to run halfway back through the entire area just because you got wombo comboed by one of these enemies is incredibly annoying. The Shadowkeep also has an enemy that tends to irk me as well, these flame-throwing swordsmen. Again, they're just too aggressive, and they love to spam projectiles at you if you try to back off. Thankfully, they are far easier to stagger than the Horn Knights, so I don't dislike them nearly as much, but they can still be pretty slippery. To be fair, tougher enemies aren't something that is new to the Souls series. All of the games have at least a couple of enemies that are harder than the rest, but the difference with those games is that they still feel fair. A good example of this are the Black Knights from Dark Souls 3. The first one you find in Faerun Keep will more than likely destroy you the first time you fight it, but they don't stay that difficult for the rest of the game. As you face more and more of them, they become easier and easier, until eventually they aren't even that much trouble at all. Nothing about the enemy changes, but as your familiarity with that enemy increases, they become easier to fight. I fought nearly all of the Horn Knights and Fire Knights in Shadow of the Erdtree, and I still don't feel comfortable engaging them. One time, I seriously even stopped and tried to watch a Fire Knight attack so that I could learn its moveset better, and then it just killed me in less than 5 seconds. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that I think these enemies were designed unfairly, to the point of being overly punishing. It's an extension of the same problems I have with this DLC's bosses, but for the sake of staying on track, I'll get into that later. Despite my issues with the Fire Knights, the Shadowkeep itself is really good. It might even be my third favorite Legacy dungeon in the entirety of Elden Ring, being only a step behind Stormveil and Leyndell. The area has 3 distinct sections: its entrance, which is designed more like the traditional Elden Ring fort, a flooded church district, which can be drained almost exactly like New Londo, and the Specimen Storehouse, my favorite section of the keep. It has a massive emphasis on verticality, and the way you ascend to its top is really creative. The first couple of floors are reached via conventional means, but to get to the 4th floor you have to jump onto this statue hanging over the storehouse. It's not the hardest thing to figure out, but it is unconventional enough to make it feel like you're forging your own path through the area, and I really like that. The rest of the area continues this trend by taking you outside and up to an entrance on the 5th floor, which itself connects to the 6th and 7th floor. From there, you can turn a mechanism in the center of the storeroom and cross it to jump onto another hanging statue, which gets you to the 8th floor and the boss. But it doesn't end there either, because on the 8th floor you can see into rooms on the other floors that you never reached. To get to them, you have to come through the Shadowkeep's alternate entrance and up an elevator, which will lead you to these extra rooms. This path also gets you to the highest point of the storehouse, its rafters. I loved this section of the storehouse the most, and while it certainly isn't the first time you've ever had to cross rafters in a Souls game, it reminded me of that first time. The tension I felt trying to fight off these bats while simultaneously also trying not to fall to my death was exhilarating, and it was the exact same tension I experienced while crossing the top of the Anor Londo Chapel back in Dark Souls 1. It was an amazing moment that reminded me of why I fell in love with the Soulsborne series in the first place. But that amazement quickly disappeared when these rafters led me to yet another mediocre boss. And now I can't avoid talking about it anymore. The bosses. This is, by far, my biggest issue with Shadow of the Erdtree, and I'm not going to sugarcoat why. They are too hard. Already, I know what some of you are thinking, so before I can even get into the actual bosses themselves, I have to first address the 3 major counter-arguments made against what I just claimed, and why I don't think any of them apply. Everything I'm about to say is also applicable to Elden Ring's late-game bosses as well. The first, and most annoying argument I've seen made is, just get good. Not only is this argument basically just an insult, it's also entirely assumptive. Because as it turns out, my problem with Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses doesn't come from a lack of skill, it comes from a lack of patience to deal with unfair design. And it's not like I'm unfamiliar with these types of games either. Excluding Demon's Souls, I have played every single one of these games FromSoft has made. And not only that, I have beaten every single boss in the series without summons. I've even beaten the Dark Souls trilogy on New Game Plus, also without summons. I don't want to come off as an egotistical narcissist here, but I have to emphasize my experience with these games in order to prove my point. And I honestly don't care how anyone else plays these games, whether that be with summons, broken builds, or just straight up cheats. If that's how you enjoy the game, then that's fine. Which brings me to the second argument I've heard: just use summons. I, personally, do not get very much enjoyment out of using summons on a first playthrough. I'm considerably more open to them on repeat playthroughs, but on my first playthrough I enjoy beating the bosses myself. It requires you to actually learn and pay attention to what each boss does, ideally resulting in an extremely engaging challenge that is equally satisfying to overcome. Because of this, summons tend to make fights a lot easier for me, to the point where they are hardly even challenging anymore. So the dilemma I have with Shadow of the Erdtree, and also Elden Ring, is that when I'm fighting an overly challenging boss, I either have to suffer through the intense difficulty until I win, or use a summon and annihilate the boss. This might sound like I'm exaggerating, but it literally happened to me in Shadow of the Erdtree. I fought a boss for an hour without learning anything, continuously getting stomped by combos that I could barely even read, and not understanding where I could possibly attack safely back. So I gave up and summoned, upon which I beat the boss on my first try. Either option was not fun for me. Getting curb stomped over and over again by an unfair boss sucks, and destroying a boss with minimal effort is not engaging. This was hardly ever a problem I had with the other Soulsborne games. So why are the bosses all of a sudden too difficult for me when they never used to be? Another problem I never had with the other games, excluding Sekiro, was my choice of weapon. If you can't already tell by my gameplay, I like strength builds. Giant weapons are the kind I have the most fun with, and they are always my go-to option when playing a Souls game for the first time. I'm sure most of you are the same way. There's probably a weapon type or playstyle that you are naturally more drawn to. So for all the dexterity enjoyers watching this, imagine if in Shadow of the Erdtree, dexterity weapons did significantly less damage to bosses, and because they're lighter, the bosses could also randomly parry you. That would suck, wouldn't it? You'd be given an unfair disadvantage compared to other weapon types. Or for people who like summons, imagine if you summoned for a boss, and it still only kept its aggro on you, while also having more health and doing double the damage. These things would completely invalidate the playstyle that you like the most. Except that Shadow of the Erdtree does invalidate a certain playstyle, and unfortunately for me, that playstyle doesn't summon and uses a Colossal Greatsword. In fact, if you use a colossal weapon in Shadow of the Erdtree, you are unintentionally making the bosses more difficult for yourself. This is because colossal weapons are committal and slow. You have to choose your openings for attack intelligently, and once you start attacking, there's no going back. This is something that I like about colossal weapons. Their use is very strategic, and that's something that used to work in the previous games. My New Game Plus playthroughs of all 3 Dark Souls games were done with colossal weapons, and I didn't have any issues with the bosses whatsoever. I never once felt like I was being punished because of the weapon I was using. I cannot say the same for Elden Ring. Its late game bosses were so fast and aggressive that you would never feel safe attacking them back. Because if you did, they could just start attacking you again or straight up move out of the way. And that's not even mentioning those bosses' new combo extensions, which they can randomly use on you. Meaning, a boss could literally do a move without a follow-up attack one time, and then do that exact same move again, but with a follow-up attack another time. That absolutely does not work with committal weapons, because if you choose to attack every time, then you'll inevitably get hit by the random second attack, and if you dodge the second attack every time, you'll miss out on a hit whenever the boss doesn't do it. This could work if you were able to cancel out of an attack with a dodge, or if the bosses had enough downtime between every attack, but they don't. In fact, if you don't attack a boss right as it finishes attacking you, you probably won't have enough time to dodge if the boss starts attacking again. Meaning if you even pause for half a second to see what the boss does next, you've wasted too much time. So at what point can you even safely get an attack in? Here's the answer. You can't. You just have to sit and watch the boss flail around until it does the 1 or 2 moves that you know are safe to attack back on. This isn't fun at all. So for all the people out there who have never used a colossal weapon before, I hope you now understand where I'm coming from in this review, because Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses have the exact same problem. But I know some of you are thinking, well, just use a different weapon or respec your character, which is the third and final argument that I wanted to cover. I have not 1, not 2, but 3 different issues with this argument. First and foremost, none of the other games have ever made you do this, and I think I've already made that clear. So why shouldn't that be expected of Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree? Well, maybe you could argue that Elden Ring is just doing something different from those games, and that From's intention was to get players to experiment with multiple types of weapons. Even if that were true, the game does absolutely nothing to tell you that. There isn't a single message or hint across the entire game that even implies that you might have to try using different weapons while fighting a boss, other than the obvious. This is especially an issue when the last 5 games were never like that. So for all the people who have played those games beforehand, when they go into Elden Ring, they'll be under the impression that its weapons work the exact same way. Because that's exactly what happened to me. That change is something you have to tell people. Look at Sekiro. It's a perfect example of a game that changes the typical Souls formula, but it works because it makes that change clear to the player. I would also argue that experimenting with different weapons isn't encouraged in Elden Ring. The way its weapon system works means that if you want to use a different weapon on a boss, you'd have to go and upgrade that new weapon first. And doing that requires you to have smithing stones, and if you don't have those, which you probably won't because you already spent them all on upgrading your previous weapon, then you either have to go and find more, or buy more. After which, you'll spend even more runes actually upgrading the weapon. Unless you want a max upgraded weapon, in which case, fuck you, because there's only a limited amount of those types of smithing stones. If the developers actually wanted players to experiment with different weapons, then why would they design the upgrading system to be so stingy and cumbersome? Probably because they modeled it after these games, in which you are expected to find a weapon that suits you by the middle of the game, and stick with that weapon until the end. An example of a different FromSoft game that does encourage experimenting with weapons is Armored Core 6, which lets you sell your weapons and gear if you don't want them anymore. So if you buy a new weapon to test it out, but you don't like it, then you can just sell that weapon and use the money to buy a different one. I think if Elden Ring did something similar to this, like letting you scrap an upgraded weapon to get your smithing stones back, then that would be a pretty obvious sign that the game wanted you to repurpose your materials on new weapons. But it doesn't, and regardless of whether you think the game does or doesn't want you to experiment with different weapons, there's a pretty big problem either way. Everything I just said also applies to respecs. In both Dark Souls 2 and 3, respecs were implemented as a sort of safety net for players who wanted to change their build. Maybe they started off with a strength build, and then realized that they didn't really like it that much. But rather than letting all of those levels they put into strength and stamina go to waste, they can reallocate those levels into magic or dexterity, giving players another chance to play the game in a way they would enjoy more. This system was in no way meant to be used to clear specific challenges. That's why they made it so that you could only respec a limited amount of times in Dark Souls 3, and that's why Elden Ring only has a finite amount of larval tears. Now, I'm not saying that I would be opposed to a game that wanted you to respec your character depending on different challenges, but Elden Ring does not give you the resources to do that. If respecking your character in Elden Ring didn't require any kind of item at all and was completely free, then yes, that would be a good sign that the game wants you to use that mechanic as much as you can. Not only that, but if you just respec your character for the most optimal build on every boss, I think that would kind of ruin the replayability. One of the things I look forward to most when replaying a Souls game is finding out which weapon or build I'm going to use. That's what changes things up for each playthrough, and even though you might be fighting the same bosses and enemies again, you can at least fight them in a different way. Don't get me wrong, I love Sekiro, but it is absolutely the least replayable out of all of the other games, and that's because you use the same weapon every time. Finally, if your suggestion to me for having problems with colossal weapons is to just use a different weapon type, then why is that weapon type even in the game in the first place? If they suck and just make the game harder, then don't put them in the game and pretend that they're viable. This isn't like the one shield in Bloodborne that's really only there to teach you not to use shields. There are many colossal weapons in both the base game and the DLC. Even if it would have been a little disappointing to see them gone, it would have at least told me that they didn't work with From's new boss design. Or maybe just don't design those new bosses like shit in the first place, I don't know. I say that, but whether you like the direction From has gone with their bosses or not is entirely subjective. If you like your games to be overly hard just for the sake of being hard, then more power to you. But I, for one, don't, because I think it's tedious and boring. I also think it takes significantly less skill and effort to make something that's just hard than it does to make something that's hard but fair. Go play Mario Maker on Expert Mode and you'll see what I mean. To me, being able to balance the challenge of a game fairly through design is a form of art. An extremely difficult art, but nonetheless one that FromSoft was able to master over the course of 10 years. For so long, they were able to walk that thin line between fair and unfair, occasionally making stumbles along the way, but never quite crossing that line fully. But now, with Shadow of the Erdtree, I can confidently say that line has been crossed.
horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered.
The first boss you're most likely to run into is the Dancing Lion, a fight that I would dearly like to enjoy. Its presentation and design is great, being an homage to the dancing lions of Chinese culture, and the way it moves around looks really authentic. If you look under the beast, you can even see that it's actually being puppeteered by two guys. The music for this boss fight is also similarly spectacular, and while I'm not going to touch too much on the music in this review, it's mostly pretty great. It might even be a step up from Elden Ring. However, that's where my compliments towards the Dancing Lion end, with the presentation, because actually fighting the lion is a whole different story. Or should I say your fight with the camera, because it is absolutely terrible. At times, this camera is seriously just as bad as the one in the Centipede Demon fight. I mean, what the actual fuck is going on here? This is just completely absurd. It is genuinely pathetic that this many games in, FromSoft are still struggling to keep the camera under control during boss fights. And what makes it all the more infuriating is that Sekiro has literally solved this problem already. The Guardian Ape fight is a perfect example of how the camera should behave when fighting a larger boss. It's zoomed out far enough so that you can see what the ape is doing, but it also pans up towards the boss whenever it starts to do an overhead attack. The Dancing Lion actually has an overhead attack similar to the Guardian Ape's, but the camera is somehow so much worse. It pans up towards the boss's head, but doesn't zoom out, so if you're under the lion, you can't see what it's doing. Which you most likely will be, because the lion can start doing this move while you are attacking it. I can't emphasize enough just how atrocious this is. But even putting the blatant camera issues aside, this boss still has a number of attacks that keep it from ever feeling fair. One of them is even an attack the boss can start the fight out with, this big forward jumping attack. You'd think after successfully dodging a move that big, you'd be able to safely get a hit in of your own, but you'd be wrong. If you attack the boss here, you are taking a risk, because sometimes the lion will snap its head back and hit you, but other times the boss will just turn around. The latter is what I wish the boss only did, because it would work so much better. Not only would you avoid the issue of trying to read an attack from the boss when it's not even facing you, but it also allows you to get a deserved hit in without the risk of taking damage yourself. The lion also has a 3-hit combo that it can pull out ridiculously fast, even after it's already done another attack. Here, the boss does the same big jump attack as before, and then a forward slam, which I dodge. So I press the attack button to get a hit in of my own, and then, all of a sudden, the lion launches into a new combo that I literally can't avoid because I'm stuck in my weapon swinging animation. How on earth was I supposed to see that coming? This might be the perfect example of a boss being overly punishing, because I don't even think I did anything wrong here to deserve being killed in the first place. I mean seriously, what was my fatal mistake here? Attacking the boss after it had seemingly finished attacking me? But all of the attacks I've complained about so far kind of pale in comparison to the lion's lightning phase, which is easily the worst element it can use against you. Unlike in the ice and wind phases, where the elements work in sync with the boss's attacks, the lightning acts on a slight timer, meaning that when the lion attacks, lightning strikes the ground shortly after. This creates a pretty big issue when trying to dodge, because if you roll through the lightning first, then you can get caught by the boss's next attack before you can roll again. This can be pretty frustrating, and it kind of makes running away from the boss the most reliable thing you can do during this phase, though that comes with the caveat of pretty easily getting stuck in a corner and experiencing the 7 deadly sins of FromSoft camera controls. The strategy I landed on was doing a jump attack through the lightning and just hoping that the lion's next attack would miss me, which wasn't really ideal. This same exact issue is also present in Elden Ring with the fight against Fortisax, so I'm really glad FromSoft took the opportunity to make the same mistake again. But the real nail in the coffin for the Dancing Lion is that it also has a grab attack which it can heal off of, because I guess losing over half your health wasn't already punishing enough. Unfortunately, the Dancing Lion is pretty indicative of the overall experience that Shadow of the Erdtree has to offer. Its presentation is great, and at times it can even be pretty fun, but the problems it has are so bad that I can no longer enjoy the positives anymore. The next boss is Rellana, Twin Moon Knight, and to be completely frank, this fight is terrible. She has the aggression and speed of Malenia without the ability to be staggered, so if you're a heavy weapons user, there is almost no point in this fight where you can attack her safely. This is also coupled with some of the most abhorrently long combos I have ever seen from a boss, which she can pull out of her ass at a moment's notice. One of her combos is even 10 attacks long, and it is a full combination of both fast and randomly slow attacks. Why? It is so ridiculous to expect players to be able to dodge this. Sure, you can learn to dodge the entire thing, but not in a reasonable amount of time. You would have to study this combo many times before you got to the point where you could recite the entire thing from memory. Dodging this combo has nothing to do with your reaction time. It's literally just a test of how well you can remember every single attack. I think a lot of the people who defend this game and Elden Ring's difficulty fail to understand the difference between doable and fair. Just because something can be done doesn't mean that it's fair. Sure, you can dodge Waterfowl Dance if you do a really specific set of inputs, and you can dodge Elden Stars under the right conditions, but that doesn't make these attacks any less bullshit. Being forced to do an extremely specific thing in order to not take damage or even die isn't fair. Most people won't even figure out what to do in the first place. It's just too much. And the same thing goes for Rellana's 10-hit combo. I honestly wouldn't be nearly as critical about this combo if it actually affected the boss afterwards, like maybe if she had to stop and catch her breath for a couple of seconds, similar to how Metyr and Placidusax seem to lose a lot of energy after doing their giant laser attacks. That way, the combo would be just as dangerous to you as it would be to her. But instead, she can just launch straight into another combo right afterwards. I swear, that is all the boss does, just combo after combo after combo. It's relentless. It's really pointed out to me just how misused combos are in Elden Ring and its DLC. I feel like in the Dark Souls trilogy, they were a lot more rare, and were more meant to be the boss's most dangerous attack, not just how they attacked in general. Even in Dark Souls 3, where boss combos are a lot more prevalent, they're still handled way better. Take Gale, for example. He has this pretty big 5-hit combo that can melt your health bar if you get caught in it. So to keep it fair, Gale telegraphs this combo with a growl to let you know that he's about to start wailing on you, giving you an ample amount of time to get away from it, while still being possible to dodge through if you really want to. Running away is just the safest option, and FromSoft wanted to let players do this because they knew it would have been unreasonable to expect them to learn and dodge every attack in a combo, at least at the time anyway. And even in Elden Ring, Godric telegraphs his combo as well. It's so strange to me that this telegraph is in the same game as this one, which isn't even long enough to let you avoid an instant death. It's almost like From gave progressively less and less of a shit as the game went on. And now the bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree have more combos than they do normal attacks. I can't tell if this is just FromSoft's way of trying to inflate the game's difficulty, or if they still have Sekiro on the brain. Either way, it sucks. And even though there's more going on in fights now, I find the combat significantly less interesting than it used to be. Even if it's slightly easier, a boss that has many individual attacks is way more engaging to me, because it allows the boss to string those attacks together in different ways every time. But with these combos, you'll just see the same attacks in the same order over and over again. It is genuinely boring. But ultimately, I think the biggest issue I have with Rellana is that it just isn't clear when she's done attacking, which makes it similarly hard to know when you can attack her back. Sometimes she only does 1 or 2 moves, other times she keeps going. I just don't have the patience to try and figure out if there's even a way to tell. And on top of all that, she can also input read, because I guess spacing doesn't matter anymore. If you can't tell, I really don't like this boss. At all. Nothing about her is interesting to me, and the gimmick with her 2 elemental swords was already done far better in Dark Souls 3 with Pontiff Sulyvahn. The only thing I like about this boss is that it can be skipped. That might sound harsh, but it is getting really hard for me to stay positive anymore. Skipping the boss is what I ended up doing on my second playthrough, and I came back to it later with more blessings to help make the fight easier. Now I know what you're thinking, but first, let me clarify some things about these Scadutree blessings. Generally, I think they're a pretty smart addition to this DLC, since most players probably won't need any more smithing stones, golden seeds, or runes going into Shadow of the Erdtree. It makes sense that there would be a new collectible upgrade to help encourage exploration. They can also act as a way to ease the difficulty of some of the early and mid-game bosses, which is something I took advantage of multiple times throughout my playthrough. However, just because they can make bosses easier, doesn't automatically excuse my issues with them. You're still going to have to deal with shitty camera angles and overly long combos, regardless of how much damage you take. And this especially becomes a problem near the end of the DLC, where having max blessings still won't keep you from getting killed in one hit. I'd also like to point out that these blessings make it way too easy to ruin some of the earlier bosses' difficulty, which is a problem Elden Ring had as well. Say you don't go to Belrod at the beginning of the game, but instead end up exploring other areas like Skado Altus and Raw Base first. By the time you get back around to Belrod, you'll probably have a lot more Scadutree blessings than the developers intended, allowing you to completely steamroll the entire area and the boss. Now, I'm not saying this shouldn't be allowed. It's a good option for the people who want to make the game easier for themselves. However, in the situation I just described, you didn't intentionally make the area easier. It was just the result of you exploring a different path, and if you're a player who likes a challenge, then you just accidentally deprived yourself of that challenge. I think the best solution for this problem would probably just be to inform the player directly on what the intended blessing level for an area or boss is, whether that be with a message or some other kind of sign. That way, the people who want an extra challenge can go in with less blessings, the people who want less of a challenge can go in with more blessings, and the people who want the intended challenge can go in with the exact amount. I know this isn't something any of the other Soulsborne games have done, but that's because those games were linear enough that the developers could reasonably infer what level most players would be at during any point in the game. With how open Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree are, it becomes infinitely harder for the developers to try and guess what level people will be at for each area. They can guess what level most people will be at, and they can try to intuitively guide players towards other things first, but that still doesn't account for all players. I thought it was pretty obvious that you were supposed to go to the Weeping Peninsula before Stormveil, but I know for a fact that there were people who went through Stormveil first and ended up going to the Weeping Peninsula way later in the game. It's a definite problem, and if From wants to keep making open world games, I really think they ought to start signposting the intended level for each area. And for all of you out there who think that might be too hand-holding for them to do, I'd like to point you towards this message at the beginning of Ariandel. It's not something they haven't done before. The Golden Hippopotamus, or as I like to call him, Sanic the Rhinocepotamus, is a more powerful variant of the Hippo enemy you can find out in the world. Other than its health and damage, there are two major differences that separate the Golden Hippo from its field counterparts. Firstly, this version has a second phase, and second, he gets an actual arena rather than just being out in the open. Let's look at the arena first, because I think it's the most pressing issue. This arena is just not big enough for the size and aggression of the boss it holds. In my experience, I found that staying in front of the boss was the best strategy for fighting it, and since the boss is constantly moving towards you, you are constantly moving away from it. Can you see what the problem is? With the arena's small size, you can often find yourself backing up into a wall, and with the Hippo's high aggression, he will almost always take the opportunity to shove his face directly into you and even through the camera, making it nearly impossible to see what he's doing next. For the field hippos, this isn't a problem you have to deal with at all, and it's pretty clear to me that they were meant to be fought out in the open. That kind of space is needed to be able to safely dodge some of its attacks, and the camera even zooms out a little to help you see what the hippo is doing. But fighting the Golden Hippo feels incredibly cramped in comparison, making the boss more difficult in a very artificial way. I also think the camera for this fight can be pretty terrible as well. I mentioned before that the camera zooms out for the field hippos, but for the Golden Hippo, I think it might actually do the opposite. For some reason, the camera feels super low to the ground, which results in multiple annoying effects. The camera can get stuck on some of the rubble lying around the arena, and the hippo's head can yet again clip through the camera if it does certain attacks while you're standing next to it. For how easy it is for the camera to do this, I seriously don't understand why From didn't do anything to fix it. I mean, they had to have known about it. In general, the camera for this fight will often just flip out for no reason, like spinning around to the other side of the boss, or dropping down under your feet. At first I was pretty confused about this one, and then I realized that the camera actually got stuck on the boss's head, so it just decided to go under it instead. Like, really? I think the better solution would be to have the camera far enough out in the first place so that it doesn't have to do that. And finally, the camera will also completely shit itself if you're standing next to the Hippo while it's doing this move. I wonder where we've seen that before. All of the problems I've detailed with this boss so far haven't really been related to the boss itself, more so its environment. However, that isn't to say that the Hippo itself doesn't have a few troublesome attacks either. The worst one to me is its running grab attack. The best way I found to dodge this move was to first run away from it, and then turn back and dodge through its final lunge towards you. I tried just dodging past, but it never seemed to work. I think this attack actually can work pretty well when the boss does it while you're a little distance away from it, acting as a sort of gap closer and giving you enough space to be able to dodge it. Except the Hippo doesn't always do that. Sometimes it'll start doing this attack when you are literally standing 2 inches away from its face. I'm guessing that there's probably a way to dodge through this attack if this happens, but I mean, come on. It also doesn't help that the hitbox for this grab isn't all that amazing either. I pretty clearly roll through the attack here, and then all of a sudden I'm just teleported into the Hippo's mouth. Thanks, game. The other move this boss has that really irks me is during its second phase, where it'll roll around on the ground and shoot out a bunch of quills. I genuinely do not understand how to fully dodge this attack. I've tried rolling and running, but nothing consistently works. You will almost always get hit by this move. The spread of the needles is too wide, and the duration of the attack is too long. Even if you ultimately don't take that much damage from this attack, this is still a really big deal to me. Anytime you take damage from a boss, it should always be your fault. It should be the direct result of a mistake you made, and if you want to avoid taking that damage the next time, then you need to learn from your mistakes. Finding ways to prevent incoming damage is what allows you to get better at a boss, and if you couldn't prevent that damage, then whether or not you beat the boss would be completely up to luck. In my opinion, a good challenge is not designed around luck, because it negates the necessity for skill. In this way, I think this attack from the Golden Hippo is completely unfair, and any other unavoidable attacks are as well. All of these issues add up to make this boss way harder than I think it should be. Its moveset really isn't all that complicated, and yet it still took me dozens of attempts to beat, because at any moment, some stupid thing can completely ruin the fight.
Mongrel Intruder.
Much like Artorias and Lady Maria, Messmer is the boss that represents this DLC, being mentioned numerous times throughout the plot and even getting his own spot on the cover. For how negative I've been so far, you might be surprised to learn that I actually don't hate this fight. Messmer didn't give me nearly as much trouble as the other bosses I've talked about so far, and on my second playthrough I even found myself enjoying the fight while still losing. That being said though, I still think the fight is probably only decent, as it has a couple of issues that tend to hold it back. For starters, Messmer is yet another extremely aggressive boss with long combos. These aspects are a lot more enjoyable in his fight than in others, but it's a type of boss design that I'm getting really sick of seeing. One of these combos is also quite finicky, to the point where I never really understood how to completely avoid it. It starts with this big jumping spin attack over your head, which transitions into a multi-stab attack before ending on a ground slam with a delayed AoE afterwards. The first and third sections of this combo are completely fine, but issues start to crop up with the second section. This multi-stab attack goes on for way too long, making it extremely difficult to properly dodge through. To avoid taking damage here, you have to roll through this attack twice, but if you're too early or late, then you'll end up getting hit at the end of your first roll. So to avoid taking damage, you have to find the sweet spot in between. This kind of attack isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as that sweet spot is easy enough to see. But in Messmer's case, this attack comes right after your camera has already flipped around 180 degrees. You can barely see what he's doing, other than that he's about to start attacking. This makes it impossibly hard to know when you should start dodging, and the timing for getting through this attack is so specific that you mostly won't get it. I think the only reason you even can dodge through it is because the spears just don't happen to hit you in between rolls during this very minuscule moment. I looked at what no-hit players did to avoid this attack, and it was just to run away from it, which I guess that's a solution, but I'm still not a very big fan of it. Time and time again, I get the feeling that FromSoft still thinks they're working on Sekiro when developing the bosses for Elden Ring, because so many of them incorporate elements from that game. This includes extremely fast and long combos, as well as moves that you have to run away from. But From doesn't seem to understand that Sekiro and Elden Ring have completely different mechanics. The reason why running away from an attack works in Sekiro is because the player is incredibly fast. You have the speed necessary to get away from these attacks before they can hit you. But in Elden Ring, you run about the same speed as in Dark Souls 3, which is to say, not that fast. So unless your positioning is perfect, running away from this attack doesn't always work either. Both solutions require too much precision for me to consider this attack very fair. For the dodging strategy, the opening you have is literally just a couple of frames. I think being forced to have this kind of extreme precision can work fairly, but not in a game like Elden Ring, where death can mean losing minutes of progress. In a game like Celeste, a death usually only sets you back a couple of seconds, so it's more reasonable to expect more from the player. And don't get me wrong, when Celeste rooms get too long, they become way more tedious than enjoyable. Ultimately, I think that's what From was trying to do with this DLC, to make really precise, skill-based bosses. However, these fights lack the refinement required for that kind of precision to work. Messmer is really close to getting there. Despite being so aggressive, his delays between attacks are long enough to comfortably accommodate for the use of a greatsword, and his combo mix-ups are indicated beforehand so that you can safely know how to react next. This is a design choice that seriously needed to be implemented for some of the other bosses in this DLC, because it's the only way to make combo extensions work, short of letting the player cancel attacks. Understanding these mechanics can lead to moments where everything flows together in an extremely satisfying way, but then, all of a sudden, this happens and everything falls apart. Precision cannot work with a hitbox this sloppy, because it ruins the flow of the fight, and it severely punishes you for a mistake that you didn't even make. Like, this seriously looks ridiculous. I don't understand why From doesn't quit using grab attacks entirely, because they hardly ever work. Even though Messmer does work in a lot of ways, these issues are what make him only decent to me, because they throw off the fight enough to shatter that precision From so desperately wants. But I honestly wouldn't be nearly as harsh on this boss if I hadn't already fought several others like it in the DLC and the base game. If Messmer was one of just a few bosses with this kind of fast-paced aggression, I probably would have liked him a lot more, because when these kinds of fights are done right, they're exhilarating. But now, we've gotten to the point where I've fought so many bosses like this in Elden Ring that fighting a new one isn't even exciting anymore. The Putrescent Knight is another example of a boss that can work well, but is ruined by one massive issue. However, for the sake of not focusing exclusively on the negatives, I'll start with the positives that this boss has to offer. The Putrescent Knight continues From's trend of throwing the player down a massive pit while somehow still managing to keep it unique, with an absolutely breathtaking fall that serves as a pretty sick introduction to the boss. I'm not sure how many more times they can get away with this trick while still retaining the same awe-inducing effect, but for the time being, it's still just as effective as before. The boss's moveset is also pretty enjoyable. It's definitely a bit weird to get used to at first, but once you get it down, dodging through these attacks is very satisfying. I only wish I could be given the opportunity to attack back after these moves, because the boss loves to gallop away like a fuckwit after nearly every attack. So you're just left there waiting for the boss to come back to you, and hoping that it does an attack that it actually stops on. Again, I feel like this is Sekiro design being applied to a game with different mechanics. In Gyobu's fight, whenever he starts running away from you, you can just sprint after him, or sometimes even grapple over to him. But for the Putrescent Knight, all you can do is sit and wait. This gets even worse in the second phase when the knight can do this giant ghost flame attack anytime he is even mildly far away from you, which is literally all the time. It is a huge time waster, one that also forces you even further away from the boss. And finally, there's this long combo he does, which you can only get a hit in on the boss when it's done attacking. To be fair, I think this combo is pretty fun to dodge, but it's yet another time-consuming move the boss can do fairly often. There is just so much unnecessary downtime in this fight, making it feel extremely drawn out and tedious. My winning attempt was 7 minutes long, which might not seem like that much time, but when every second is spent analyzing exactly what the boss is doing, it feels considerably longer in the moment. And any failed attempt that got anywhere near beating the boss was about 5 or 6 minutes long. It is immensely frustrating to put so much time into a fight, and then have to do it all over again every time you fail, especially when half of that fight is spent waiting. And that's not me exaggerating either. I literally ran a stopwatch on my winning attempt, and the boss spent around 3.5 minutes just wasting time. The knight's propensity to run away also means that you don't get any kind of reward for dodging through its attacks. You don't take any damage, but that's not really a reward, you're just avoiding being punished. That'd be like giving a child nothing for Christmas and then saying, well, at least I didn't give you coal. Like, yeah, I guess it could be worse, but that doesn't mean it still doesn't suck. That's a bit of a weird analogy, but I think you get what I mean. If you successfully dodge through a boss's attack, it is only fair that you get to attack back. Otherwise, it feels like the boss is playing the game instead of you. And just because the boss is on a horse doesn't mean it needs to be constantly running around. If this boss just stayed next to you, it would seriously be so much better. You could keep in the moments where the boss runs out and then weaves back towards you, but drop the pointless waiting. Out of all the bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, the Scadutree Avatar is one of the few that I actually like, and while not quite my favorite fight this DLC has to offer, I don't have many major issues with it. In a sea of extremely fast, aggressive bosses, the Scadutree Avatar's slower-paced moveset is an immediate breath of fresh air, one that is well telegraphed, and most importantly, fair. Some of the thorn attacks this boss has are great examples of this. This AoE is not only telegraphed appropriately ahead of time, but it also comes out in waves, giving you some extra time to avoid the attack if you haven't gotten completely away from it yet. And while summoning this smaller thorn patch in front of itself, the Avatar leans its head out to the side so that you can still get some hits in. This is another one of those hit the boss on the head to do the most damage type fights. However, it's done in a way that's a lot different from what we've seen before. The amount of health the boss has is pretty intentionally misleading, as it's split across 3 different health bars. This makes it seem like you're doing a ton of damage to the boss when you really aren't. I'm normally not a huge fan of a boss having multiple health bars like this, because it can be a bit disappointing to think you beat the boss only for an entirely new health bar to show up. But with the Scadutree Avatar, I think it was really tastefully done. The boss still has a normal amount of health, and each new phase feels like a welcome extension to a fight that would have been pretty short. Speaking of tasteful design, I also really like how the explosion AoE was done for the boss's 3rd phase. After going off, it shoots out some projectiles that you have to dodge to avoid, but they come out on enough of a delay that you can wait until after you see the explosion to start dodging. This is a far more interesting and enjoyable test of your reflexes than if these projectiles came out instantly, allowing you to react to what you see rather than forcing you to develop an internal timer. And besides, Elden Ring does enough of that already. Unfortunately, the Scadutree Avatar does have one attack that I don't really like. Whenever the boss is far enough away, it can summon these golden projectiles, which aren't so bad when there's only one set at a time, but occasionally the boss can summon 3 sets and shoot them at you back to back. This attack is extremely difficult to avoid, especially the final volley of projectiles that contain about twice as many. At the very least, getting hit by this attack won't completely murder your health bar, but it can be a little frustrating. Thankfully, that's all I have to complain about for this boss. While not overly ambitious, it's still a solid fight, and it's one that reminds me a lot of the simpler bosses of Souls games prior. One of the biggest issues I've had with Elden Ring is how woefully inadequate Torrent is during combat, and no boss exemplifies that more to me than Commander Gaius. With the revered Spirit Ashes promised to bolster the Spectral Steed's ability to deal and negate damage, I honestly thought this was something Shadow of the Erdtree was going to address, but lo and behold, it didn't. Even with the new Spirit Ashes, Torrent is just as fragile as ever, with most bosses being able to knock you off him in one hit, or even straight up kill him. Upon which, you will get up in the most agonizingly slow way possible. Perhaps this wouldn't be so bad if you could actually dodge on Torrent, but of course you still can't. You just have this shitty little dash that is mostly ineffective at avoiding attacks. All of this comes to a head with Commander Gaius, who has so many attacks that prey on Torrent's weaknesses that I'm left wondering why they even let you summon him in the first place. This includes a projectile that is nearly impossible to avoid, a lunge that insta-kills Torrent and is extremely easy to get caught by, and worst of all, a giant ground AoE that you will almost always get hit by. Oh yeah, and it insta-kills Torrent too. This attack is so bad that I would seriously just jump off Torrent and take the damage on foot, because it made me take less damage than when I was on Torrent. Some of you are probably thinking, well, just don't ride on Torrent then, which, yeah, I guess, but then why did they even include him in the fight at all? And unless you're fighting the boss in a very specific way, off Torrent, Commander Gaius will waste your time by constantly spamming projectiles and charge attacks. While I haven't tested it, this makes me think that the best way to fight this boss is probably a mixture of being on and off Torrent, jumping off whenever you see certain attacks. I'm curious to see how well this would work out, but either way, I think my point about Torrent still stands. And for a game with such a heavy emphasis on combat, I don't think it's that unreasonable of me to want Torrent to be more fleshed out. Romina, Saint of the Bud, is my favorite boss in Shadow of the Erdtree. When it works, her fight has a very enjoyable flow to it, due to a refreshingly moderate tempo, and several attacks that are extremely satisfying to dodge. My personal favorite is this double attack from her Centipede, which after dodging through the first swipe, you can jump over its second swipe and get in some extra damage. In general, Romina's moveset is pretty well telegraphed, and while she has a lot of delayed attacks, there are little cues that indicate when they're about to happen. For example, she raises her weapon up a little higher before she swings at you, and while doing this overhead slam, her stinger glows to indicate when you should dodge. These things help make Romina more fair and balanced. However, that's not to say that her fight is perfect. Far from it, actually. She still suffers from a lot of the problems Elden Ring bosses tend to have, but I actually didn't notice them on my first and second playthroughs, because her placement in the world is pretty strange. She's located at the end of Raw Base, which I think is meant to be a late game area, and she even guards an important story event that can only be interacted with after you have beaten Messmer. But if you fight Romina late game, she becomes extremely easy. On my first playthrough, I even beat her on my first try, and on my second playthrough, I fought her with less Scadutree blessings to try and make the fight more difficult, but I only ended up dying once. Because of how little trouble I was having with her, I kind of initially assumed that the fight was fair, but then I wondered how fair Romina would remain if she was even more punishing. So on my third playthrough, I went straight to her first, and that's when issues started to crop up. Romina's biggest problem is that her second phase transition, which summons a large AoE around her, has literally no telegraph. Its windup is only a couple of frames long, and if you're standing next to her while she starts doing it, you will take damage. She starts doing this transition as soon as her health bar crosses a certain threshold, so for melee users it's pretty impossible to work around, as you obviously have to be standing next to Romina to even get her health bar over this threshold in the first place. This AoE isn't exclusive to Romina's phase change either. She can do it at any point during the second phase, often after she finishes other attacks when you think you can safely punish her back. I don't think I need to explain why this is a problem. Also during her second phase, Romina has this big combo where she flies at you from one side of the arena to the other, ending it by diving into the ground and leaving a trail of explosive butterflies behind and around her. Despite how intimidating these attacks might look, they actually aren't the problem at all with this combo. Rather, it's the AoE trail she leaves behind her. At first I wasn't even sure if you could consistently avoid taking damage here at all, but after looking it up, I found out that the way to avoid these AoEs was to dodge left and backwards during her final attack. While this combo isn't unavoidable, I don't think that the way you have to dodge through this final attack is very intuitive, as the natural instinct is to dodge through this attack as she flies towards you, not backwards. But regardless of whether you think this is fair or not, these AoEs also make it impossible to hit the boss after she finishes this combo, making this another example of an attack where dodging through it gets you nothing in return, which is a problem I explained with the Putrescent Knight. Other than that, Romina's body can occasionally wrangle you across the arena if you're next to her while she's running around. This isn't the worst thing ever, but it is a bit weird looking. Even though these issues annoy me, what works about Romina's fight is good enough overall that it's still my favorite fight in the DLC. It just lacks a degree of polish that I think From is intentionally starting to leave out. Obviously, I don't think it's reasonable to expect From to not make a mistake now and again, and some of these issues have cropped up in other Souls games as well. However, I don't think it's fair to call these issues mistakes in Shadow of the Erdtree, because it implies that they were accidental. At this point, I'm fairly confident that they aren't, because where these issues used to be few and far between, I can now come up with an example of unfair design for nearly every boss. Clearly, something has changed. I mentioned before how impressive it is that From was able to make a DLC of this magnitude, and the Mother of Fingers is yet another example of that. She's a hidden optional boss locked beneath the Cathedral of Manus Metyr, a fight that requires you to complete a pretty lengthy quest before you can access it. It's a part of the game that seems to harken back to Elden Ring's Natural Born of the Void, with a similarly fascinating quest line that leads to an even weirder looking boss. The build-up to this fight is top-notch. However, I think more effort was put into the presentation than the actual fight itself. Metyr has quite a few issues that I think highlight the problems that Shadow of the Erdtree has overall. The first issue is that many of her attacks can be randomly extended, which is a problem you should be all too familiar with by now. Metyr's arena is also strangely too small. At a glance, the arena seems massive, but in actuality, it's surrounded by invisible walls that only become visible once you near them. Now, this wouldn't be a problem in itself, but the boss is just aggressive enough that I would consistently be driven back into these walls unknowingly. This is a problem that I've never experienced with any of the other Souls games, even with super aggressive bosses like Orphan and Gale. And that's because their arenas are actually large enough to accommodate that aggression. Metyr's clearly is not, otherwise I and others wouldn't be consistently running into its edge. And it's not a matter of being able to see where the edge of the arena is either. I've never run into the edge of the Four Kings arena, and it's completely black. This creates problems for obvious reasons, as it prevents you from dodging attacks that you could have otherwise avoided had you not been stopped. Actually, there was one time where being at the edge of the arena did help me avoid an attack. However, it was complete luck that it happened. Speaking of that move, it is yet another instance of nearly unavoidable damage. At least once during the fight, Metyr will summon this black hole that shoots out two giant lasers. While visually great, this attack is undoubtedly unfair, as the first laser is essentially impossible to dodge, and the second laser requires extremely precise positioning to avoid. I hate that I have to keep saying nearly unavoidable when referring to these attacks, even though this attack basically is unavoidable. However, if you have a very specific Ash of War, it is just barely possible to dodge the first laser by using it at the exact right moment. Even so, I would still personally consider this attack to be unavoidable, because it is absolutely ridiculous to expect players to do something so specific to avoid this attack. And I'm almost positive that the way you can dodge it was not something From even considered or intended. They literally just wanted you to take a hit here. It's depressing to see how much From's philosophy on bosses has changed, and where before they would intentionally go out of their way to keep things fair and balanced, they are now deliberately making things unfair. It's a complete dismantling of the hard but fair mentality they've had for so many years, and I can only wonder how much longer this series will remain interesting if they keep going this way. Out of the last three bosses this DLC has to offer, Midra is probably the most well-designed. However, I'm still not quite sure how I feel about him. His fight, while mostly fair, is extremely difficult, and because of that, I think it's mostly up to personal preference whether you like him or not. I do enjoy a good challenge, obviously I play these games, but Midra might be a bit more challenging than I personally enjoy. It took me a good amount of attempts before I could finally beat him, and for a lot of those attempts I didn't really feel like I was learning anything new. I was just banging my head against a wall until my timing finally improved enough that I was able to break through. For me, a lot of my enjoyment of more difficult bosses comes from learning. I like being able to recognize what a boss is doing, and then apply what I've learned into my next attempt. It gives you a very obvious feeling of improvement, and that makes each new attempt exciting. But for Midra, I pretty much learned every move he had after the first hour of attempts, making the rest of my time fighting him kind of a slog. His fight has so little margin for error that even learning what his attacks are isn't enough, and any one mistake can cause everything to spiral out of control. He is almost constantly attacking you, he hits extremely hard, his combos require super specific timing, and his attacks even inflict a status effect that locks you in place and does damage if activated. You can imagine how well that usually turns out. And on top of all that, Midra also has some really weird quirks that can throw off the fight enough to completely ruin attempts. The worst one involves his Frenzy Beam, which is a ranged attack that Midra uses when you're further away from him. The move is tricky enough to deal with at a distance, but for some reason, Midra can inexplicably use this attack when you're standing right in front of him, which can easily get you insta-killed even at full health. While this isn't unavoidable, it is completely unexpectable, because it's an attack you always see at range. And it's just fast enough that even having a split second of confusion about seeing it is enough to get you hit by it. Midra can also use this attack as a form of input reading on heals, which is possibly even worse than the other example I gave, because you literally can't avoid it. The duration of the healing animation is too long for you to be able to dodge in time. Regardless of the avoidability of these occurrences, I'm still not a very big fan of moves that can instantly kill you. They're far too punishing. The other thing I notice with Midra is that rarely he can cancel his follow-up attack after he floats over to you, which can get you hit by whatever move he decides to do instead. I have no idea if this was intentional or not, but it's extremely bizarre whenever it happens, because these two attacks almost always happen as a pair. Here, after he floats over to me, you can literally see me wait and then dodge because I was so used to the timing of what should have been his next attack. Except, he didn't do that attack, and I got hit by a grab instead. Again, I could have avoided being hit by this grab here. However, I don't think it was at all unreasonable or unexpected of me to panic when the boss did the complete opposite of what I was expecting. And for a fight where you have to learn so many patterns, letting the boss randomly break one of them is bound to cause issues. But honestly, I think these patterns are a big part of what makes me feel so mixed about this fight in the first place. They don't have a natural rhythm to them at all, and they feel very specifically designed to punish reacting instinctively. Meaning, you can't just dodge when you think the boss is about to attack you, like when they start raising their weapon, but instead you have to dodge on a certain timing. Mix-ups like this aren't a bad thing on their own, and I probably would have enjoyed Midra's fight more if he was the only boss who acted like this. But he isn't. We've already seen this kind of behavior with Rellana, Messmer, and the Putrescent Knight, and it makes me think that From designed these fights like this because they knew it would be the easiest way to trip players up. You can't just avoid an attack by dodging at an instinctive moment, you have to learn the exact timing. Which sucks, because knowing how to instinctively dodge used to be a very valuable skill. It meant that even if you were fighting a boss for the first time, you could still reliably dodge through their attacks just by reading their movements. Now, it seems that being able to recognize patterns is the more useful skill. Again, delayed attacks, or attacks that require a specifically timed dodge to avoid, aren't inherently a bad thing, and when used moderately, they can even be a great way to switch things up and keep the player from getting too comfortable. But to use these kinds of attacks as often and aggressively as Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree do is just way too much. It makes the bosses more difficult, yes, but it comes at the cost of making them feel less natural. Ultimately, it's up to personal opinion whether you like this kind of boss design or not. But with the way bosses were designed in previous Souls games, I can't help but prefer reactive fights more. Bayle is a spectacle fight. He gets an entire area as his build-up, he looks super intimidating, his second phase is a hailstorm of enormous explosives, and you can even summon a crazed Drake warrior to help you fight him, who spouts some of the most over-the-top dialogue I've ever heard. Even Bayle's subtitle, The Dread, is very intentionally trying to seem cool. But when you look past all the spectacle, what you're left with is yet another dragon boss that doesn't quite hit the mark for me. As much as I want to like Bayle, his fight shares a lot of the same issues I have with the series' other optional DLC dragon, Metyr. Personally, I am not a huge fan of Metyr's fight, but it's actually not for the reasons you might expect. Metyr is a fair boss, but his health bar is so enormous that it extends the fight out to a completely tedious length. And it doesn't help that so much of the fight is spent just waiting for him to attack, running in and hitting his head, running away, and then doing the same thing over again until he's dead. I honestly think it's pretty boring. Unfortunately, Bayle is the exact same way, and my winning fight against him was about 9 minutes long. But even though I'm comparing the two, I would still much rather fight Metyr than Bayle, because at least Metyr doesn't come packaged with all the typical problems that constantly plague Elden Ring's bosses. For a giant dragon whose wings are completely destroyed, and who is missing a full leg, Bayle is shockingly mobile. Specifically, he has this combo that ends in a delayed overhead slam, which after doing, he can randomly jump halfway across the arena, spin 180 degrees around, and shoot fire at you. While not super punishing to the player, I'm still not a very big fan of an attack where dodging through it gets you absolutely nothing in return. It's essentially just an annoying time waster in a fight that is already too long. Plus, this fire breath attack he does has a pretty weird quirk where the fire will sometimes jump out towards you as you're running away from it. I have no idea what causes this, but I'm guessing it has something to do with positioning, and that you're more likely to get caught by this the further you are from Bayle. That kind of positioning requirement is way too specific for me to consider it fair, and if this just happens randomly, then that's obviously even worse. But to get back to the actual combo, it can also produce some pretty atrocious camera angles if Bayle happens to start doing it near the edge of the arena, though these camera issues are pretty much present throughout the entire fight. Even when trying to stay in front of his head, Bayle has several attacks where his body gets in the way, which paired with the noisy visual effects can make it extremely difficult to tell what he's doing. Bayle also has another combo that he can randomly extend, because of course he can, this is Elden Ring after all. The combo starts with a forward stab, then a bite, and from there Bayle can either be done with the combo, do an extremely fast headbutt, or breathe fire around himself if you're too close. But it doesn't end there either, because if Bayle does the headbutt, then he also has a random chance to either be done with the combo, or do his giant overhead slam attack, or breathe fire. How are you supposed to keep track of all that? That is literally a random combo extension within a random combo extension. I watched a no-hit run of this boss, and the guy intentionally baited out the attack where Bayle breathes fire around himself just to avoid trying to guess what he would have done otherwise. It's completely absurd, and while these combo extensions aren't the worst thing for some builds, they are extremely punishing for greatsword builds. With a colossal weapon, there is no point in this entire combo where you can safely attack back, other than if it goes all the way through, which is rare. And if you try to wait, then you'll most likely miss out on a chance to hit the boss back. This is why Bayle took me 9 minutes to beat. He just has so many attacks that are not safe to punish. It's the ultimate way of telling me that my playstyle isn't valid, and it's the ultimate way of leaving me dissatisfied with the boss as a whole. Shadow of the Erdtree's final boss is spectacularly terrible. I have no other way to describe it but as a coalescence of all of the worst aspects of this DLC's boss design. If I were to go into detail on every issue I have with this boss, I would probably be here for an hour, and at this point, I don't even have the energy anymore. So for starters, I'll just list out everything I don't like. In Radahn's first phase, he has 2 combos that he can randomly throw an extra attack into, and the Q into his Metyr attack looks exactly like the start of a different attack. This sword swipe is usually the start of one of his combos, but sometimes it'll lead into an extremely delayed attack instead. Radahn also has a few moves that you have to react insanely fast to avoid, like this string of attacks here, and his giant gravity well. This move in particular suffers from several problems. If it's used on you from far enough away, then you can get flung across the arena in a way that looks completely ridiculous. And if you dodge through this move but are still close to the boss, then he will do his nearly unavoidable follow-up attack as if you had been sucked in. And finally, I find Radahn's combos to be extremely tedious. He does the same 2 over and over again, which you dodge through the exact same way every time. All of these issues help to make Radahn's first phase feel incredibly overtuned and boring. But even so, it is still significantly better than his second phase. I mean, I've really gotta hand it to From this time. They've truly transcended the medium and made a boss that can not only hurt you in-game, but also in real life. And by you, I mean your eyes. Radahn's second phase is a complete visual mess, as you are constantly blasted with dozens of blinding lights that make it nearly impossible to see what the boss is even doing. I genuinely would not be surprised if this fight triggered someone's epilepsy. Jesus Christ. This becomes even worse if you're playing on a last-gen system, because the insane light show Radahn produces can easily tank your frame rate. So if you don't have the money for a modern console or a very nice gaming PC, then tough fucking luck. This adds yet another layer of difficulty onto a fight that is already one of the hardest I have ever fought. Radahn is just so unrelenting during his second phase. On top of his first phase moveset, almost all of his attacks now shoot out holy beams, he can send out dozens of clones to pummel you, his Metyr attack is followed up by an insane multi-hit ground slam, and his gravity well attack is just straight up death if you get caught in it without a shield. And his combos just go on and on and on, and oh my god, when is this going to end? What's worse is that this specific combo is coupled with a telegraph that is used for another attack. When he raises his sword up like this, he either shoots out a ring of light or launches into this combo. Radahn's second phase is also very explosive. He has this giant holy AoE that you can barely get away from in time, and when he shoots himself out of the sky, it causes an explosion that covers nearly the entire arena and can very easily kill you. On my first playthrough, I was pretty fed up with the bosses by this point, and I knew how much of a nightmare it would be to beat this boss solo, so I just caved in and used the Mimic tier. But this fight is so hard that even using a Mimic tier, it still took me around 2 hours to beat. How I ended up winning was by keeping Radahn's aggro and blocking all of his attacks, letting my Mimic tier sneak in some damage while the boss was focused on me. I was essentially acting as a human meat shield so that 2 NPCs could do the actual fighting. How fun. I should have just left it there, but on my second playthrough, I finally went back and beat the fight solo, which took many excruciating attempts and liberal use of the fingerprint shield. Because what else was I going to use? Radahn has so many attacks that I have literally no idea how to avoid. But even after all that, I'm still not sure if he's harder than Malenia or not, which is a true testament to just how shitty that boss is. But I shouldn't even have to compare the two bosses in the first place. Everyone knows how ridiculously hard Malenia is, and that includes FromSoft. They should have taken that feedback and used it to try and avoid making the same mistake again, not to try and one-up themselves. Malenia is easily the worst boss in the entire series, and I was so sure that From couldn't possibly make a fight that bad again. And yet, here we are. How much further is From going to try and push the difficulty of these games? Yes, these games are meant to be challenging, but this kind of difficulty goes far beyond what most people could even find enjoyable. It is completely and wholly unfair, but From doesn't care. They seem determined to keep their games hard no matter what, which is a dangerous mentality that spells the death of their commitment to keeping things fair. Promise Consort Radahn is genuinely one of the worst bosses I have ever fought in a video game. It is a complete and utter joke of a fight, a laugh in the face of video game design, and for that, FromSoft should be ashamed. And that's where Shadow of the Erdtree has left me. Even though I knew there was a good chance things would stay the same going into the DLC, it still isn't any less infuriating to see. It goes to show that, even despite all the well-made criticisms toward this game, what speaks the most is money. As long as From continues to gain success from their newfound formula, they aren't going to change anything anytime soon. I love the Soulsborne series. It has produced some of my favorite games of all time, and I want to keep experiencing that. But how can I when these games are no longer for me? I remember the triumph I felt when I first beat the Bell Gargoyles in Dark Souls 1. It was a victory that I had earned all on my own, and the sense of accomplishment I gained from that was completely genuine. But now when I beat a boss, all I get is a feeling of relief. Relief that I no longer have to suffer through a fight that only serves to waste my time. A fight that makes my choices, the way I want to play the game, feel completely invalid. That's not something that I enjoy, and not even a world as expertly designed as Elden Ring's can make up for that. So for the time being, Shadow of the Erdtree marks the end of my interest in From Soulsborne series. I am not going to keep paying for games that I don't enjoy, and unless some serious changes are made in the future, I will not be playing whatever comes next. If From only wants to see the success, then I'm not going to contribute to that anymore. Especially when there are so many other games I could be playing instead.